Welcome back to our reflections on the Gospel of Matthew. In this session we'll look at chapters 21 to 23. I mentioned before that Jesus exercised a ministry in Galilee. He then took the road to Jerusalem, and in what we're reading tonight, he actually arrives in Jerusalem. And the very first incident in chapter 21 is that arrival. So, chapter 21. Jesus sends several of the apostles to go and prepare for his coming. They're told to go into the town and find a colt for him to ride on, and then they bring it back, and then the procession into Jerusalem actually begins. It's quite a solemn procession. I think Matthew's suggesting that there's a large crowd involved. So I think the crowd would have been those that were with Jesus in his arrival, those who had perhaps become disciples throughout his ministry in Galilee, but also the people of the pilgrimage. I want to just talk about numbers for a moment. At the time of Jesus, Jerusalem would have had between 20 and 50,000 people. And at the time of the Passover, for example, that number, the number of pilgrims would be something like 100 to 200,000. So really what Jesus is walking into here is really a huge gathering of people, most of whom don't belong to the city of Jerusalem. And I'm making that point about the crowd because often we think that the crowd who welcomed Jesus into Jerusalem was the crowd that cried, "Crucify him," at his trial. Now, I think personally there are two crowds here. The first is a welcoming crowd who are associated with Jesus. And the Jewish leaders make it possible that they're frightened of arresting Jesus in public lest the crowd turn on them. And yet they do it in secrecy, and then they have a crowd that says, "Crucify him." And even in that crowd represented there, the emphasis is on the Jewish leaders persuading the crowd. So what I wanted to suggest here is that perhaps we need to think of two crowds. However, let's look at the crowd and the entry. The entry is a solemn entry, the reference there to Jesus riding in a colt. Mark had suggested that this was, he makes an allusion to the prophecy in the Old Testament in Malachi, but Matthew actually quotes it. Remember, Matthew was always interested in showing the traditional Jewish background of the Catholic movement. So he actually quotes that, and what the quote is pointing to is, "Your king has come to you." So in a sense, this is a royal greeting. The title king hasn't been significant throughout the gospel, but I just cast you back to the scene with the Magi. The scene of the Magi is about Jesus as King of the Jews. There are a lot of other things we saw there, but basically it's the establishment of Jesus as King of the Jews, and from now on that king title is going to be more important until it climaxes with the crucifixion and the title Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. So as Jesus enters, you'll notice that people get branches. This is where our Palm Sunday comes from. But you'll notice also that they use their cloaks. They put their cloaks down. In the Old Testament, when one of the kings of Israel was recognized, the people threw down their clothes so that he could walk on them. So a lot of images here that are pointing to the fact that this is a royal welcome, and that I think that the royalty that they're welcoming is not really the messiahship that wants. I think they're just recognizing here is a messiah figure, but they have not yet come to that awareness of what this messiah figure really would be. So an important emphasis of Jesus entering into Jerusalem. The whole city was sort of involved. You can imagine at a time of pilgrimage, people are sort of a bit more excited and committed in their faith at that time. And here is somebody comes who has a reputation as being a prophet. So clearly Jerusalem would have been have a significant upheaval in the arrival of such a person and the preaching of such a person. And what we have in the section we're dealing with now is the ministry of Jesus in Jerusalem. Now, the first aspect of the ministry, that he comes into Jerusalem and he goes into the temple and he drives out the money sellers and the people who were selling the animals there at the temple. My first thought when I read that many years ago was a bit like our Catholic shrines. You go to a Catholic shrine and they've got all sorts of shops around so that you can buy medals and things like that. And if you took it all away, it doesn't affect the shrine itself, because the shrine itself is important. But that's not the situation here with the Jerusalem temple, because what Jesus is doing in driving out the animals and attacking the money sellers is in a sense putting the temple out of business, because these animals were there to be sacrificed in the temple. And the money changers were there because when you wanted to buy one of these animals, you had to use temple money. So they were there to translate the foreign money to temple money so that this could happen. Now, what Jesus is doing, therefore, is really attacking the temple itself. And if we go on in the early church and look particularly at the Gospel of John, we can see that really Jesus is taking the place of the temple. What was the temple? It was the unique presence of God in the midst of people. And so Jesus himself is now taking that particular role. So I just wanted to point to the fact that it's more than just clearing out the business side of the temple. That was a necessary thing to make the temple work. More importantly, are the references there to the scriptures. Again, Matthew is looking to the Old Testament, and he talks there about my house will be called a house of prayer, and you've turned it into a robber's den. The context of those quotes from the Old Testament is that there's been a breakdown between the sacrifice and the living of the covenant. So, like most of the prophets, it's an effort to call the people back to the covenant. And we'll see within the sections we're dealing tonight that one of the things that Jesus has against the Jewish leaders is that they're right with all the public things, but there isn't behind those things the spirit of the covenant. So this is more than a cleansing of the temple, it's a challenging of the temple. In other words, that there's a new situation, and even in the Old Testament there was a reference to the fact that eventually the temple would not be needed. And in the book of Revelation, talking about the New Jerusalem, there's no need for a temple because the Father and Jesus are there. The leaders are obviously concerned about this, and they say to Jesus, look what's happening. And Jesus doesn't say it's wrong, he says no. This is what should happen, and he talks there again about the Old Testament, saying that the children would give praise if praise wasn't being given by others. So this is an attack on the fidelity to the covenant. I want mercy, not sacrifice, was a saying in the Old Testament. Not that the sacrifice was important, but sacrifice without mercy was something that really wasn't what the covenant called for. The next scene there is something that's a bit surprise to us. There's the barren fig tree. Again, I think we have to recognise that in the Old Testament, the fig tree was often used as a model for Israel itself. And when Jesus goes to the fig tree, it's obviously alive, it's got leaves on it, but it has no fruit. And Jesus condemns it, and it fails immediately. I think we understand what Jesus is doing here by the words that he then goes on to speak about, namely about the importance of faith. And I think the action that Jesus does there is what we call a prophecy in action. In the Old Testament, Jeremiah put a yoke on his head and went round the city to show that Jerusalem would fall. Other prophets broke a jug to sort of indicate how Israel would be spread up. So this is a prophecy in action. It's not just an act of sin against the environment. It's meant to illustrate that Israel had not been faithful. And that's the sort of image that the prophets would have used in the past. But he goes on then to say that faithfulness is important. And if you had faithfulness, then you could actually move mountains. And if you have faith, everything you ask in prayer, you will receive. So I think it's plugging into that issue that underlies the whole gospel, that Israel did not respond. And that response to Jesus was the thing that would bring you to salvation and closer to God. It's understandable that the Jewish authorities should then come and ask, what is his authority to do that? I haven't been doing, I'm sorry. That's it, I'll keep going through. I'm just catching up. My talking has got further than here we are. So we went to the temple. Went out there, and here is where that's the fig tree. We've done that, and here we are. The Jewish authorities rightly questioned his authority because they were people who would have had the leadership role. So they asked for the reason why he had done this and what authority he had. And Jesus puts to them a question like the ones that they have often put to him. And he asked the question, was John's baptism, was its origin heavenly or human? And that put them in a difficult situation, because to say it was heavenly, Jesus would then say, why didn't you listen to him? And if they say human, well, that would affect their relationship to the crowd, because the crowd actually thought that he was a prophet. He represented heaven. So they were not able to answer, and therefore Jesus doesn't tell them by what authority he has been doing the things that he does. He then goes on, and this relates to what's just said about the man that had two sons, because he's going to use the two sons to talk about the relationship between the Pharisees and the tax collectors and the sinners. And the story of the two sons is both are asked to go into the fields. One son says no, but then goes, and the other one says, yes, I'll go, but then doesn't go. And Jesus forces the people that he's talking to give the answer. And they rightly say it's the first, because in the end he actually did what his father wanted him to do. And then Jesus attacks them, talking about the fact that John came as a righteous figure, but you did not believe him. And yet the tax collectors and prostitutes, they did believe him. Even after seeing that, you refused to think better of it and believe in him. So it's not just a question, as I often point out, of saying, Lord, Lord. No, it's doing the will of the Father. It's responding to the one whom the Father has sent, which is the person of Jesus. He then talks about another parable, which is a well-known one. We have it in our liturgy, about a man who planted a vineyard. Now, if the fig tree is a symbol of Israel, the vineyard is an even greater symbol of Israel, the prophet Isaiah particularly making that point. So this owner talks about the landowner doing all the things that were necessary for a vineyard, and then when the time came, he decided that to get the produce, or his share of the produce, and so he sends his servants to the tenants. And first of all, they thrashed one, killed another, and stoned a third. So what he does, he sends a larger group, and they dealt with them in the same way. And then he sent his son, and they thought that if they killed the son, they might have some claim on the property. And so they seized him, threw him out of the vineyard, and killed him. And Jesus says, what will the owner of the vineyard do? And they all say he will bring those wretches to a wretched end and lease the vineyard to someone else. Now, the important thing is that they know and they realise that Jesus is speaking to them. And then he uses that quote from the Old Testament about the stone which the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, to signify that really the Son whom they rejected was really the key figure in God's revelation. So they heard the parable and they realised that he was talking about them. And they would have liked to arrest him, but they were afraid of the crowds who looked on him as a prophet. And that's why I separate the two crowds. And this is the importance of Judas, who was able to let the authorities know that Jesus prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane on a regular basis. And so he was able to be arrested quietly. You'll notice that this ministry in Jerusalem is definitely an attack on the Jewish leadership. And we'll see in chapter 23 as we go down that Jesus has some very definite things to say about them. So that concludes chapter 21. I might just pause for a moment to see if there are any questions that anybody would like to raise. There is a question. Why did the religious leaders question Jesus' authority? I think they did it because they saw that Jesus was leading people in a different direction. And the thing that the Jewish leaders had was their tradition. They were the ones who sat in Moses' seat. That's a Messian expression, the seat of Moses. And they were the ones who had the authority, as it were, to speak. Now, Jesus, in chapter 23, is going to undermine that authority to a certain extent. So I think that the issue is that Jesus was leading people away from the interpretation of the Jewish tradition that had been advocated by the Pharisees. So Jesus was a definite threat to them. And we've already seen in the Gospel, in the past chapters we've talked about, that they actually wanted to get rid of Jesus and they were ready to kill him. And when he goes to trial, as we'll see next week, it's not a trial that's looking at things objectively. The trial is about what can we find that would enable us to have this man put to death. So Jesus is threatening the role of the Jewish leaders. I want to speak about that a little more when we get to chapter 23. So let's now look at chapter 22. And it begins with the parable of the wedding feast. And this is another parable that relates to the Jewish leaders and to those who do not accept Jesus. So the scene is that it's a king who is going to have a feast for his son's wedding. I mentioned already tonight the fig tree is an image of Israel, vineyard as an image of Israel, and of course what we have here is a banquet. And a banquet was a symbol of Messianic times and a symbol of the end times. So really this king that's about to give a feast, it's a sort of something that would happen quite naturally, but it's also symbolic of salvation history. So there are two stages in the way the feast was run. There were people who were invited, so that meant you got an invitation to come, and then you were notified when everything was ready. And so what happened in this particular situation is that everything is ready, and the message goes out to tell them. So what happens here is that the people don't come. So he sends out some more, and those two didn't come. So he then sends them out into the roads and the highways and the byways to collect everyone they could find, bad and good alike. And the wedding hall was filled with guests. I wanted to point out that in the way that this was done, there were both good and bad at the wedding feast. We've seen in the symbol of the wheat and the darnel how the the landowner said, leave it till the end of time and we'll sort out the differences between the two. And that image of the fish net, where so many fish were gathered, but then they had to be sorted out. So in a sense, that's what we're going to find here, that all of these people have been brought in almost without any discussion of whether they should be there or not. And so that examines what happens next. When the king comes in to look at the guests, he notices a man who was not wearing a wedding garment. The servants were sent into the streets. I wonder how many people would have been walking around in a wedding garment. So clearly this is a sort of a separate story that is carrying out another aspect of what is taking place. And I think the man without the wedding feast is the one who was inappropriately chosen to enter the kingdom. The final verse there in that particular thing is that many are called, but few are chosen. So that's again that idea that many are called, and there are many who say, Lord, Lord, but not all do the will of the Father. So it's a statement of the fact, talking about the those that wouldn't come to the kingdom, come to the banquet, which is another way of saying wouldn't respond to Jesus. And then the banquet hall was filled with people that did respond, but among those there were some who acknowledged Jesus but were not living in a way that was a response to him, not being his disciples as well. Then there follows another scene about the Pharisees questioning Jesus, and that they're out to trap him. So clearly this is a very vicious sort of a dialogue going on between Jesus and the Jewish leaders. And the question they say is, well, first of all, notice how they wrap him up and say what a great person he is, and he'll speak out, not worrying about what the consequences are. And so they ask this question about paying taxes to Caesar. Now, of course, if he says yes, pay taxes to Caesar, then the people are not going to like that. But if he says don't pay taxes to Caesar, then the Romans won't like that. So whatever answer he gives could be expected to put him in strife. But Jesus asks for the coin, and his famous reply is that give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and to God what belongs to God. That seems to answer the question, or a fitting response. Some people would suggest that there's a hidden barb in that saying, and the barb is that Jesus is saying to the Pharisees, who were very strict in paying Caesar, because they recognised they had to do it, but perhaps they weren't as strict in the things that related to God. So the phrase or the saying could be interpreted as saying, be as attentive to the things of God as you are attentive to the things of Caesar. So a rather clever response that I think is a definite challenge, and that's what Jesus is doing at this time. He's not hiding anything, he's challenging the Jewish leaders. And when they heard this, they were amazed and they left him alone. I think leaving him alone is not a statement that they'd been convinced, but rather they couldn't find a way to actually trap him. The next group that come along are some Sadducees. The Sadducees don't appear a lot in the scriptures, but they do appear. They were not like the Pharisees and the scribes. They were more a family type that were related to the Jewish leadership as members of the Jewish governing body. But the thing about the Sadducees is that they didn't believe in the resurrection. And their question is meant to trick Jesus, because they take up the Jewish practice in Deuteronomy 25:5 of how one can provide for children of a brother that died without children. And the way to provide was for the widow to marry the next brother, so that children, and those children would be attributed to the first brother. And they have this sort of situation of when the woman gets to heaven, she's been married to the whole seven, so who will she be the wife of in heaven? And really, again, Jesus doesn't accept their basic approach. He's sort of saying, look, you've got no idea what happens in the resurrection. And the point that is made is that in the resurrection, the marriage does not take place. So at the resurrection, whose wife was she? I think we've missed a bit of that section there, but don't worry about it. I can explain. What Jesus is saying is that life is different in the resurrection. In other words, it's we can't look at it simply in terms of the way we live now. This conflict between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the Pharisees believed in a resurrection. When St. Paul was brought before the Jewish council, and he was in deep trouble, he got out of the trouble by simply raising the question of the resurrection. And the Sadducees were against it, and the Pharisees were for it, and in the end he got away as they fought among themselves. So a real issue, but again, they didn't succeed in catching Jesus. So the Pharisees then have another test. Their test is, which is the greatest commandment in the law? Now, this is a subject that was treated quite broadly at the time. The Pharisees said that there was something like 603 commandments in the law. So it was quite a common question to say, how can we sum up these 603 commandments? So the question is, which is the greatest commandment of the law, was a legitimate question that would have been asked at the time of Jesus. Now, Jesus gives the answer. In Luke, the lawyer himself gives the answer. So in Luke, it's not so much a test, but clearly here it is a test. And Jesus gives 2 points there. He talks first about loving God with all one's heart and soul. And this is a part of that essential prayer that every Jew would have said every day. So I suspect that this would have been a very common verse that would be highlighted as a summary of the Old Testament tradition. And then he talks about loving your neighbour as yourself, which is from a different part of the Old Testament. Now, it's quite likely, we're not sure whether Jesus is the first to bring these two together, but I think that he is the first perhaps to say, as he does in verse 40, that on these two commandments hang the whole law and the prophets. I think Jesus opened himself to this sort of question because, as we saw in Matthew 5 and 6, Jesus spoke about loving in a new way. And I think that the important thing about the message of Jesus is that it's not just an emphasis on love, it's an emphasis on a particular type of love, that we are to love as Jesus loved us. We are to love as the Father loved Jesus and passed that love on to us. So Jesus' statement there is a summary, and I think we can recognise there the importance of love in our Christian tradition. The next incident there is something that's rather typical of the rabbinic style of argument. There's been a great emphasis in the Gospel, particularly in the early narratives, the infancy narratives, of making sure that Jesus is recognised as the son of David, because the Messiah had to be a son of David. So Jesus could not have claimed to be the Messiah had he not acknowledged that particular background. And both in Luke and in Matthew, the genealogies are important, mainly just to establish that Jesus was a son of David. But it becomes clear that Jesus is more than the son of David. He is the Messiah, and he is the Son of God, as we've seen already. And so Jesus talks to the Pharisees there, and he says that how is it that David in the Spirit calls him Lord when he says, "The Lord said to my Lord"? Now, there's a reference there to the psalm, and of course David is seen to be the origin of the Psalms. So here it's David, the Lord, talking about the Messiah to come as my Lord. In other words, it's putting Jesus above just being a son of David, and in the Gospel we can see he is seen to be a son of God. So this is something that people, they actually take it up. So that's the end of chapter 22. Let's pause for a moment to see if there are any questions. Okay, we don't have any questions, so I'll just move on and we'll look at chapter 23. In chapter 23, we have a very detailed criticism of the Jewish leaders. And I'd like to suggest that this is, there's a lot of Matthew himself in this. Clearly, what we have here are the woes against the Pharisees. We know the Beatitudes, blessed are those, that means they're in good standing with God. Woe is those, they are not in good standing with God. So we're talking here about the woes of the Pharisees, and Luke has a number of woes of the Pharisee, different to Matthew, probably coming from the common source that they had. But I wanted to emphasize that what we have in this chapter is something that Matthew has worked through. It's not saying that he was the first to talk about this issue, but that in recording the traditions that came to him, he works them over in a significant way. So the first thing he talks about there is that the Pharisees, well, first of all, he's talking to the crowds and his disciples. This is a fairly public statement. And he's acknowledging that the scribes and the Pharisees occupy the chair of Moses. So they've got a legitimate role, as it were. But he then says that you must therefore do and observe everything that they tell you, but do not do what they do, since they do not practice what they preach. Now, as we go on with these woes and recall other situations, this seems to be a much more positive approach to the Pharisees in this particular sentence than we see elsewhere. Jesus is acknowledging that they occupy the chair of Moses, and therefore what they say is letting the people know what is in the law of Moses. I think we've got to realise that at the time of Jesus, most people wouldn't have had access to a Bible, to an Old Testament, that they wouldn't have known much about their background faith. And the Pharisees, and not the Pharisees so much, but the leaders and the scribes, they were the people who did have access. And so the only sort of information that the people had about their tradition was through these people. So Jesus is acknowledging that. But I think what he's going on to say is he's right. He's saying that they do say what is in the law, but it's their interpretation of the law that he's going to criticize. And the fact that they don't practice what they preach means that they're actually living an interpretation of the law that is not what is the best thing that the law actually teaches. So the things he puts there, they put heavy burdens on people without trying to alleviate them. They like to do things that were seen by others. I remember reading in Augustine maintained that the most difficult thing of all to get rid of is that we like to be respected by others. And we often do things because it brings the other's attention to us in a good sense. And I think that's what's being said here, that they're giving in to that self-centeredness and that pride where they're using their leadership to get all sorts of privileges. I suppose we call that clericalism in modern terms, using their office to get things that they had no right really to have. But Jesus here is in a sense not speaking just to the Pharisees, he's speaking to his disciples as well. So in a sense, this criticism of the Pharisees, of the Jewish leaders, is really a talk to the disciples of Jesus. The greatest among you will be your servant. Anyone who raises himself up will be humbled, and anyone who humbles himself will be raised up. Now we saw this when the sons of Zebedee the mother of the sons of Zebedee asked for a privileged place, Jesus went on to say, well, that's the way the Gentiles do it, but that's not the way that we do it. So the same message is coming here. And when he says you mustn't be allowed to call others father or teacher, it's not just to be taken literally. It's meant to say that there's only one Father, the Father in heaven, and the teacher is Jesus and those whom he has sent. So the point there being made is that they're not to raise themselves up, but to recognise the role that they have, which is really a role of service. The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. So going on from there, we have the woes. There are 7. Some say 8, but 7 is probably the normal number. So they're addressed as hypocrites and blind guides. They're the two things that stand out about this leadership. And the first thing that they've got there is that they shut up the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. In other words, their interpretation of the Jewish law creates such a situation that it makes it difficult for people to go into the kingdom. And of course, them not going in themselves makes it even more difficult. And then he goes on to say that they travelled around drawing people into the Jewish faith, but then they make that person twice as much a child of hell as you are. In other words, they're getting converts, as we might get converts to the church today, but in doing so we have to be sure that we are preaching to them the true message of our gospel. And I think that can happen in our own day, where some people draw people into the faith but don't give them the best presentation of what the Catholic Church or the Catholic teaching is. And then he goes on to talk about blind guides. And this is where you can see how the Pharisees had manipulated things. If you swore by this particular thing, then that didn't matter. But if you swore by this, then it did matter. And Jesus has already said once before, just say yes or no. But the point being made here is that they've got all sorts of attachments to the traditional law that makes it difficult for people to actually exercise it. And then he goes on to say that they're hypocrites again, and that you pay your tithe of mint and deal in cumin and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, righteousness, mercy and good faith. I think what we've got here is that conflict between the exterior and the interior. The Pharisee in the temple spoke about all the things that he had done and thought he was better than the publican who said, Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner. And I think it's a danger in any religion that the external things can take over. In Islam, for example, there are 5 external things that a good Mormon person would do. But again, it depends on the intention with which they do. In the past, we emphasised the commandments of the church, that you had to go to the sacraments once a year, you had to be married before the parish priest and 2 witnesses, you had to contribute to the support of your pastor, all of those things. A lot of people did all those things, but they weren't as necessarily involved in righteousness, mercy and good faith. So I think Jesus here is not only criticising the Pharisees, he's pointing to things that we can easily get caught up on the right things to do, but neglect the more difficult. In other words, we strain out a gnat and we swallow a camel. And then again, Jesus says, you clean the outside of the cup and leave the inside full of extortion and intemperance. I think that's the same thing that we've just mentioned, that they've got to have an interior dimension, not just the external washing and cleansing of things. And that's followed up by the very next one, which has a similar message, that they are like whitewashed tombs, whitened sepulchres. They look handsome on the outside, but inside they are full of bones of the dead and every kind of corruption. Now, leaders can easily fall into that. Our own leaders can fall into that. Not saying every leaders do it. And to a certain extent, I often think that the way the Pharisees are presented in the gospel is a sort of a typical model Pharisee. In other words, it's not meant to say that every Pharisee is like this, but that these are the sort of issues that Pharisees are liable to fall into. And in pointing that out, Jesus is saying they have fallen into it, but we should get the message that we too can fall into those same things that the Pharisees mentioned. So he then goes on to talk about the fact that the Pharisees honour the prophets of the past. In other words, they build monuments to them. But in fact, they continue the practice of not living the covenant. And when prophets come from God to challenge them, they don't respond. So they're not responding to the prophets as the people in the past didn't respond to the prophets, even though they praise the prophets themselves. So you can see it's that they're sort of saying that we're better. I said, well, we wouldn't have done that in the old days. But in fact, the way they're acting and the way they will act in relation to the Christian community is clearly showing that they have that. So the conclusion there, you serpents, brood of vipers, John the Baptist used that language, how can you escape being condemned to hell? And then the word speaks, I am sending you prophets and sages and scribes. Some of you will kill and crucify. Some you will scourge in your synagogues and pursue from town to town. So this is the logical conclusion of what's just been said, that they really are doing to the followers of Jesus what the earlier Jewish people did to the prophets. So this generation is going to be judged, and he makes the point that their judgment will indeed be significant. And he finishes chapter 23 with this lament over Jerusalem. You that kill the prophets and stone those who are sent to you. In other words, the conclusion of what he's just said. How often have I longed to gather your children together as a bird gathers her chicks under her wings. So we can see there that loving attention of God in the Old Testament, but he concludes, and you refused. So that's the major issue of the early church, the refusal of people to respond to Jesus. Look, your house is left to you deserted. For I say to you, from now on, you shall not see me until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. If we just hearken back to something we saw at the beginning about the fig tree. The fig tree was a prophecy in action, showing that it just died suddenly and is a symbol of lack of faith, a symbol of faithlessness. And that same point is being made here at the end of this particular session of chapters that we've been looking at, that they are now acknowledged as being unfaithful again, and they're not going to be able to relate to Jesus until they become faithful, until they can say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. So that concludes chapter 23. Let's pause again to see if there are any questions. There is a question. How do we sometimes focus on minor religious details while ignoring weightier matters like justice, mercy, and faithfulness? I think the answer to that question is the depth of our relationship with Jesus. I think when we begin, our faith is really external. If you look at children, the faith of children is largely externally. They're learning about the faith from the world or the Catholic world within which they live. But I think that we need to come to a stage where we noticeably turn inward. And that's what we commonly talk about as conversion, right? You can say you're a Catholic, but you can come to a stage of conversion where you sort of say, well, look, I've been a Catholic, but I now want to deepen my commitment to the Lord. And that's a conversion point. And I think it's only when we do that that we look at these other things. I think it's very normal for people to be more conscious of the externals in an earlier stage of their maturity. And I don't mean they're just children, I mean adult people who haven't matured in their faith, that they're conscious of the external things. But as we move interiorly, we begin to notice other things. I did my studies on a man named John Cassian, and he used to say that it's like going into a dark room. That when you go into a dark room, you can only see the big pieces of furniture. But as the light grows, you can see the smaller pieces of furniture, and as it grows, you can see the smaller things that are on the mantelpiece. In other words, as we come closer to the source of light, in other words, closer to the person of Jesus, then we see more clearly those weightier issues of justice, mercy, and faithfulness. And we can find many things in our church history where there wasn't justice, mercy, and faithfulness. But I think that they're the signs of people who haven't yet matured to a deeper relationship with the Lord, where those are the things that become important. I think there's a very definite stages in going to God in our tradition. The first stage is overcoming our passions. In other words, just controlling those aspects of our life that have been affected by sin, and focusing to gain control over the gift of the Spirit is self-confidence anyway. But the second stage is the stage of the virtues. And it's when you begin to grow and reflect on the virtues that you're looking at justice, mercy, and faithfulness. In the first part, you tended to look at the commandments, things that you had to do, as it were. But in this stage, your eyes are being opened to other things that you have to do. That Jesus didn't just say, keep the commandments. He said, teach what I have taught to you. And so I think what happens there is that we need a maturity in our faith to become more aware of justice and mercy and faithfulness. And I have a personal opinion that really in past, going back a good way, but it within my lifetime, I think the church preached that first stage rather than this more mature stage. In other words, we preached that people had to stay out of sin. In other words, that they had to keep the commandments. But I think it was only in terms of religious and to some extent clergy where people were forced, not forced, but invited and helped to become more mature in their faith, so that those people did have that insight. And it's not to say that some lay people didn't have that, but I don't think we helped them to come to that maturity as much as we could have and as much as we should do today. So thank you for being with us again. We look forward to next week. Next week we'll begin to talk about the discourse. Remember, 5 discourses in Matthew, and the last one is what we call the last discourse, the eschatological discourse, about the future, about the passion, and about the coming of Jesus at a later time.